All right, thank you so much for being there. It's Today with John and Helen on Plus TV Africa. You missed our first guest on the show today. We just talked about the importance of being aware in your neighborhood. Now we will be moving to what does it mean to impact your community. Discussing this with us is Oluwatosin Ishola, and she's an international development professional. She's a humanitarian and an entrepreneur. Tosin is passionate about providing social protection for vulnerable groups, even as she advocates for social justice, inclusive development, and bridged inequality gaps. Her non-profit Together for Needs initiative has reached over 7,000 persons, providing varied support and empowerment for disadvantaged groups. And it's a huge pleasure to have you join us on the show this morning, Tosin. And you look beautiful.
Thank you.
May
I ask you, Tosin, how do you manage to get all of this and still look so calm?
Play with us. We had two big ladies on the show this morning.
Yes.
I'm so happy to be here.
I can call you Tosin, yeah?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Feel free to call me Tosin.
Yes. Yes. So, Tosin.
Okay.
Communities are what they are.
Yes.
Because they share certain structures and maybe codes.
Yeah.
Do we have any choices by way of changing any of these codes?
I think that the structure really does speak to connectedness, and the codes speak to the principles, that guide the behavior in the community. And the way communities are formed, there are all kinds of communities. There are business communities, there are, your fiscal communities in terms of like borders, and all of that. But what makes you part of the community mostly is because of some of these codes, which, become acceptable to you. If it was customs or traditions, you were born there, it becomes the way of life, and it may be hard to change. But I think that the goal of even any change when it comes to community should be improvement, probably doing away with bad practices, negative or harmful practices that do not promote community health or community well-being, not just to tear the community apart. So I think that the way the change would be effected is where the issue will be. Would it be ownership? Would there be ownership where people say, this really should be changed? There shouldn't be female genital mutilation. We shouldn't be, killing twins. We should, people must come, to a realization that a practice, a code, a principle is not progressive, is not helpful, and then seek to change it. And then it has to be, done in such a way that people realize that this change is one of the things that people really struggle with. So we have to be careful how we go about these changes if we want success, as the outcome. If you want to scatter things, you can say, I'm going to pull out, but those are not, those kinds of approaches do not solve the problem. It's about how can we do it, collaboratively to achieve a desired better outcome.
Okay. Community, we hear people during elections or whatever they do to choose who their leaders are. A lot of mayhem, a lot of confusion at some point in time. So how does a community choose its leaders and influencers? What's the best way to go about it?
I think that, depending on how the community is structured or formed, different people would have ways by which, their leaders are to be chosen. For certain communities, it's even expressly stated from establishment that this community will be led by people in this family. If it's a tradition, it's a royal family, that they own the titles, forever. There's really nothing you can do about it. With democracy and, how we are now structured, look at tier level, state government, and all of that, people have to elect their leaders, or appoint them. Some communities, the business community may be based on capacity, not even just, but I think that what should be at the core of electing any leader or influencer is you're finding someone who has vision, who has compassion, someone who has a clear direction of where he's leading the rest of the community, someone who listens. And I think most importantly is it helps when it's based on merits, where everyone can clearly see that regardless of culture,
we know her.
Yes, track record, regardless of culture or race or religion, because that's one of the things that seem to be holding us back as a people, just waiting for when the next region should wield power, whereas we know what we need and we can get what we need regardless of where in Nigeria you know, the leader comes from. So those are, you know, in my opinion, that regardless of how the community is formed, we should look out for key things like passion, compassion, you know, direction, you know, because sometimes people don't even know where they are leading you. So it's hard to follow.
Tosin, you've made it sound
It's a lecture.
You've made it sound so easy.
I know.
So I'm going to make it a little more difficult.
Difficult, right?
Because a few times you've talked about how the community is formed, how the community is structured. Now, see if you can answer this.
Okay.
Who decides how a community is structured?
I think that, you know, again, because it depends on the context or what kind of community we're talking about, you know, but for example, in Nigeria, the way the responsibility for structure is in the hands of our leaders, you know, it's a top-down approach. Mostly sometimes the constitution already does determine how things will be done, how structures, you know, so it's not. And then even for normal communities, policies influence it, and that's always the better way. So that someone doesn't wake up tomorrow and say, let's change structure. People already know that this is how we would elect our leaders. There will be a voting system. It will be minority. If 3 people are present in the meeting, you know, out of 5, you know, things like that. So policies, and I think that that's really depends on the kinds of community we're talking about. But most times it's always better if it's influenced by a written code, you know, a constitution, a policy, or whatever else that guides, you know, the affairs of that community.
Excellent.
That's how I look
She
at
got
it.
it.
Did she answer?
It was supposed to be a tripwire question.
She got it again.
Okay. So, I'm not making this difficult at all. John is about the difficult
Thank
ones.
you.
So why is it so important to focus on the less vulnerable in communities? And who are the less vulnerable in communities, for
Or
example?
the more vulnerable.
Yeah.
The more vulnerable.
The more vulnerable.
She means the
yes,
same
the more,
thing.
Yes,
Yes.
less, yeah.
It's so important to focus on them because the health of the entire community is important to everyone, right? The health and well-being, and if everyone, almost like the crab mentality, if everyone else, they'll keep pulling each other down.
Okay.
You know, nobody really will be able to make
Get up.
significant progress if there's some people who are not making progress. It's just the way it is. When we focus on the less vulnerable people, we see reduced crime. We have peace in the community because they're the ones that will cause mayhem. You know, we also see that we are really making progress because if you think about issues like the NSAS, what has happened is that we thought we were making progress, but many of these more vulnerable people are tools in the hands of political allies, and then they say, you take 400 naira, and they sabotage the entire process, you know, and that's what even will still happen in the next elections. You know, you find people, we are saying we want change, it's hard, you know, and they can't see it, so we need to carry them along. So when you focus on how can we do that? Empowerment, speaking, information, you know, just sitting around with some of these people and saying, don't sell your votes. It doesn't make sense to someone who is hungry, you know, and needs that money. But also by reaching out, how much are they giving you? 400, I'll give you rest. You know, what can you do in your own capacity, depending on how the community is formed, to make sure that no one is left? We kind of have to just pull ourselves together, you know, just to make sure that no one is pulling us back and we are all moving forward in the right direction. So nobody should be left out. And I think that to categorize more vulnerable people, it really will be basic things like health, you know, how they're doing in terms of like health, food, shelter, you know, education. And I think education, let's even, you know, peg that as the most important because that's really where the exposure, you know, to do things better come from. When people go to school, we begin to say, oh, this is not how to do it. I realize that there are better practices. You know, I realized I don't have to sell my vote. I realize people are just taking that, you know, but it comes from exposure. They really can do, you know, beyond what they know. And that's where we can then bridge the gap to share knowledge, share the right information, and then just pull them, you know, along.
And I am exposed enough to know that communities in Africa, you know, seem to tap a lot into traditions and cultures. You know. So how does this affect the impact?
I think that there will always be negative, you know, and positive impacts, you know, of some of our traditions. Breastfeeding has always been a good cultural practice, and it remains so. Even when many people didn't agree, you can now see doctors encouraging, the importance. That's a good practice. Female genital mutilation was not, killing of twins, like I spoke about, was not, and some of them are negative, and of course we should seek to abolish them. So there will always be negative impact on some of our traditions and cultures as we erode. Some people would not agree. They believe it's just Western infiltration. What makes you think that is more superior? But I think when all the cards are on the table, we can see when something is more progressive, when something does us better, gives us better outcome, we can choose that alternative rather than just being so fixated. Everyone in Nigeria believes that their religion, their culture is more superior, than the other. But it's good for us to sometimes recognize where this is a better approach. Let's take it.
Sorry, Helen, I have to dive in here. Now, Tosin, let's go personal. Let's go personal. I see a lot of advocacy qualities in you.
No.
How far do you go with, what you've said to us now? I mean, we'll go a long way if you stood in front of 1,000 people. How much of that do you do?
Okay, so I do majorly two things. On the first level, I run Together for Needs initiatives, a non-profit advocating social protection for vulnerable groups. And we do that by providing seed capital support, education grants, scholarship opportunities, skills training, maternity relief, and all of that. And our goal is many of these groups, widows, orphans, persons with disabilities, the elderly are the worst hit, and there's only so much you can do to lift them out of poverty without these approaches, this safety net, this social protection. That's why we do, what we do. And the beautiful thing is, as I continue to do this work, I saw a lot of gaps, and that has now led me to co-found, Lafiami, which is an health aggregator or a social enterprise, trying to provide affordable health insurance to millions of Nigerians. And that's because as I interacted with people in some of the communities that we worked, I realized that their health, was in the way, and they were making poor decisions. They were giving Antinos 9,000 naira without proper diagnosis. Antinos will give everybody the same drug for malaria, treat them for the same things. Whereas if they paid the same money for an affordable health insurance, they get better diagnosis and live longer, and take less risks. So I do these things, in many communities across Lagos with my team, and we've impacted over 7,000 people.
Brilliant.
And we look to do more.
Brilliant.
All right, we look to do more.
And I'll send you a bill for the commercial.
You asked for it. Okay. Oh well, Lagos is cosmopolitan. Lagos is big and huge. Everybody's in Lagos. One of the major challenge of Lagos is the street urchins, the area boys and the area girls, and they live with us. They've come from the villages, our communities, and they live amongst us. Now, how do we begin to reach out to these kinds of people without intruding in their personal spaces? It's a special, it must be some special grace and knowledge to be able to get them together and impact. How do we do that?
I think it's always better for us to do it, from a leadership standpoint, and leadership in terms of, who do they report to? What associations do they belong? Where can you find them as a collective? Just so that, because you may not be able to reach everyone one by one, but when you do that, with the associations, and they see reason, it's easier for them to then pass on programs and say, okay, what can we design, that will be acceptable? And of course, design with them in mind. Because sometimes you also have to ask them as a collective, what do you want? Because sometimes we assume that they want to get off the streets, but they may not want to get off the streets. There may be other benefits. It's the same way people go into a community and think that, people are going to fetch water from miles. I'm going to build them a well. These women are going so far. You build the well and they're not fetching water there. You're wondering why, and they're saying, every time we take that walk to the stream to fetch water, that's the only time we get to leave the house and gist as women, and our husbands will not frustrate us. That's an excuse. And you thought you were solving the problem by building them a well closer, but they enjoy the time off to the stream, so we always have to build with, in inclusive ways and asking people, what do you really want? If I do it like this, will it work? And all of that. So yes, I think that's at the core of it.
I belong to an organization, that interacts and supports the community. I'm sure I can say I belong. I'm a Rotarian.
Please do.
I'm a Rotarian.
Oh, yeah.
So, and I can tell you for free that impacting a community is no easy feat.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, could you tell us some of the pros and cons, the do's and don'ts, that we need
based on your experience?
Just to wrap up in 1 second.
1 minute. 1 minute. Okay, I think that, like I said, we should always make sure that when we reach out, to a community, we know what they want and what is acceptable. I think that's a major deal breaker, because most times it determines whether the outcome will be successful, or not. So we shouldn't just pass things down to a community or just think that we know what they want. We should always carry them, along. And then, of course, the right stakeholders, because sometimes you're doing all of these things, but you've not even checked that you're not erring on the side of the law, or stuff like that. So just to make sure that we do our due diligence, when it comes to designing programs, interventions, or coming up with projects. I think that's the most important thing that we need. Once we make sure that our due diligence is right and we're really sure about what we want to do, we're not making promises we cannot keep, because sometimes what people do is then you go and change their life. You take someone from a slum, take them to a GRA, but they're not going to survive there because there's no community. It's not there. So you just make sure that even though you have the right intentions, you do your due diligence, and make sure that there's also ownership.
I'm going to enter your head, because you're so...
And she did it without even stuttering.
Yes. Like I always ask, in case we have missed something very important in this conversation, what would it be? In like a line or 2, 3, 4, 5 words?
Let's make sure that we're, intentional about reaching out to people, building relationships, seeking consent, while we do, those things. But just making sure that in our own little way as individuals, we're showing kindness to a neighbor, we're saying hello with a smile, if that's all you can do, even if you don't have something to give, physically, just make sure that you're really showing that you're there. That's how we can look out, for one another in our communities, and we don't have to hear that someone just passed and then be surprised that, I never knew they were going through this. You never asked.
And that's your 2, 3, 4, 5 words.
Wow. Yes. And while you're doing that for them, you're doing it for yourself.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you once again.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been awesome.
Thank you so much.
I would have given you a hug, but I'm far away.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Okay, it's still today with John and Helen. You have met our 2 guests, one more to go. After the fitness segment, which is next with Eric, and standing in for Pharaoh on that segment that I so much love is Fumi today on the show. Please stay with us.